we welcome you all to our series on vulnerability. We have already had two different webinars / sessions. First was on mental health and disability law, and then was gender violence and workplace harassment. Today's session is on vulnerability of children and the law. Amongst us, we have speakers of immense knowledge and repute. Already, out of these 5 panelists, 3 panelists have come on this platform of Beyond Law CLC on one occasion or the other. Professor Shashikala Gurpur, who is Director, Symbiosis Law School, Pune, is the brainchild behind this entire vulnerability series, coupled with the fact that we had the webinars during the last week, which triggered off with mental health and disability law. She needs no introduction, but be that as it may, the persons who have joined for the first time, she's the director of SLS, plus her name lists in the 100 legal luminaries of LexisNexis of 2016. His articles on different perspectives and her insights on different issues speaks volume amongst themselves. Then amongst us, we have Honorable Justice Roshan Dalvi, former judge of the Bombay High Court. The day when I had invited her, fortuitously, when I was seeing my YouTube of Beyond Law CLC, I saw one of her videos. Thereafter, I realized that she has immense knowledge. I would be very candid about that. Plus, she's a prolific speaker. It was a pleasure hearing her. Welcome, ma'am. Her expertise on different aspects as a lawyer, as a judge, because they say judges don't speak, they speak through the judgments. But we are fortuitous enough that after her judgments, we will have her insights on the different perspective, which is one of the burning topics, especially during COVID-19. Welcome, ma'am. Then amongst us, we have Honorable Justice Shalini B. Joshi, a former judge of the Bombay High Court. We have already known the knowledge what she, when she speaks, her judgments were also treated during their time, and even today, they are looked upon on different perspective of law. Then Mr. Anil Malhotra, I am quite lucky to share that he comes from our bar of Punjab and Haryana High Court bar. His knowledge on different perspectives, especially towards the children, and he has been appointed as an amicus on different issues, even during this COVID-19 time, when it was lockdown. He had been appointed on a vital issue. I will ask Mr. Malhotra when he speaks for this to introduce what were the topics, larger issues, larger law points where it has been required. He has been appointed as amicus. The participants who do not as such know what is an amicus. Amicus is known as a friend of the court, and he gives his insights. The courts generally feel that he has a knowledge which would be vital for a vital issue to be adjudicated. Then we have Professor Lakshmi Jamolkar. Her knowledge also speaks volume. All 5 speakers have contributed in their own way in respect of children and the law. Their inputs on different sessions, and more so during the webinars during the lockdown period, shows 2 things very clearly. Number one, that invariably during the lockdown, one reaches a person who has an immense knowledge. And despite the fact we were in Chandigarh and we requested the judges from Bombay to give their insights, shows that the testimony of the fact that all these speakers have immense knowledge. Mr. Malhotra has always been kind enough to give his insights, not only on the platform, even otherwise. We look upon him as an elder brother and a person who has immense knowledge. Since we have 5 speakers, and as Professor Shashikala Gurpur said, that we should maintain the timeline. We had already have different perspectives on different scopes, because COVID-19 will also be touched, and we will also be having question and answers. And we are also lucky enough to have Professor D.N. Johar. I was a student of his. He has been recognized not only as a professor, but in a judgment in respect of the tenancy matter. Even the Supreme Court acknowledged in the judgment that his insights in the tenancy law uh, were duly acknowledged in the judgment. He is taking still classes, and students of law or as a lawyer who want to understand, he's always accepts and guides the students. We are blessed that he's with us. Suveer Sidhu, who is a former secretary of the Member Bar Council and presently Member Bar Council. He's a young, vibrant lawyer who has been taking a lot of webinars so that the lawyers, because he believes that the strength of the bar improves with the better knowledge, and better knowledge is not only disseminated through books but also through webinars. And webinars, as what were earlier seminars, now webinars are the new big things to look forward. Without taking much time, I will request Professor Shashikala Gurpur, Director Symbiosis, to give the insights and the thematic introduction to all this. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikas. It's a pleasure to address this house and also to join my fellow speakers on the panel. I have had the privilege of sharing the space of educating future lawyers with these eminent co-panelists, one or the other. For example, both Justice Shalini ma'am and Justice Roshan ma'am have been our distinguished judge scholars in residence, and we have had the privilege of engaging their expertise. I mean, Justice Roshan will have to start now, but Justice Shalini has already contributed a lot, as you all know. We have had another honorable personality here, coming as distinguished visiting professor to our institute, that is visiting expert, that is Advocate Anil Malhotra, with his multinational family law understanding and also in training our students in global legal skills, which is a very, very rare niche kind of expertise. We have had Professor Lakshmi Jambolkar also in the list of distinguished visiting professors with us, especially with her expertise in the area of international mediation, private international law, and human rights law, and her passion for international family law. So she, in a way, invited herself by her enthusiasm last time itself when we had the discussion on the theme of domestic violence. So thank you, ma'am, for your expertise coming into this platform. I have my colleague, Deputy Director and Professor Dr. Bindu Ronald also. I saw her. We have Professor Johar, the great honor of having him also here as a listener as well as hopefully respondent. So the proceedings are going to go this way. We will have soon after my thematic introduction of about 10 minutes. We have to have Justice Roshan Dalvi ma'am going in, who will be speaking on POCSO and its social dimensions. We will have Advocate Anil Malhotra unveiling the vast knowledge and experience in the area of child support and custody in its implementation and enforcement, particularly in the COVID challenges context, in national as well as transnational context, because he's a seasoned family law practitioner. We have Justice Shalini ma'am thereafter speaking, and she would be highlighting prosecution of child abuse in case of orphanage. Then Professor Lakshmi Jambolkar would come in to respond from her standpoint for about 5 to 10 minutes. So this is the structure which will be followed by question and answer, where we will have other experts rendering their comments or questions. Let me lay out before you, within my limited schedule, why this vulnerability series? Why did we embark upon this collaboration with this knowledge partner, namely Beyond CLC? There is a Beyond Law CLC. There is a reason. We saw that vulnerability is not just about one's physical frailty. It is about vulnerability in the sense of susceptibility to pain and suffering. Because for the benefit of those who have joined newly, let me once again go to the basics, the etymology of the word vulnerable. It comes from the word vulnus, which means a wound. So the vulnerable is the one who is in pain, in suffering. So when we look at vulnerability, it's not just physical wound. It could be emotional wound. It may be one's susceptibility to such suffering due to changed circumstances, which could happen, as I was narrating in earlier incident. a powerful man like MD of or founder and MD of a multi-billion company was susceptible to arrest, was vulnerable to arrest in a country which did not agree with the politics and kept him in the railway prison for 7 days. So vulnerability could be political. It could be born out of one's inability to discern the world, to make sense of the world. For example, a multimillionaire who suffers from mental health issues, who is not loved by anybody in the family. Everyone thinks he or she is a kind of nuisance and tries to commit this person to institution. So with all those wealth to one's name also, one could become vulnerable. Vulnerability could be rendered by age, by physical frailty, by, as I already told, by a sudden dawn of somebody's mental illness. So there are many ways by which one person is forced or compelled to undergo pain, undergo suffering, undergo marginalized treatment. So we thought that law's focus on this in India has been a kind of fractured approach because it has been underwritten by and informed by the sense of political dimensions such as disadvantaged minority, socially disadvantaged. So we thought there is a need for a platform whereby all these pain need to be captured with one theme. We had the scholarly work of Martha Feynman, a lead feminist who wrote about vulnerability much earlier, where women's vulnerability to pain, women's vulnerability to suffering was not just about them being aged, them being young girls, but it was something else. The very thought process which was exposing them to be vulnerable, despite having so much capacity, not being able to realize that capacity or utilize that capacity. Thereafter, vulnerability became a very important vocabulary in the judgments of European Human Rights Court's judgments, European Human Rights Court. So their vulnerability was explained as susceptibility to suffering due to political reason or due to stress. So the stress could come from disaster, it could come from crisis. And for us at Symbiosis Law School, Pune, the theme of vulnerability has been very important, especially when we looked at research ethics. So I had to study this topic and enlighten my colleagues in our 8 departments when they were looking at studying children. So for me, the starting point of vulnerability was children. Then it was one of my students who was working on child soldiers in warlike situation, especially in rebel areas. If I can be very straight, Naxalite areas or terrorism context. So internationally, we have had refugee crisis. We have had Al-Qaeda crisis, where vulnerability of children was very much in focus. And United Nations, through its guidelines called ERIC guidelines, talked about ethical research in case of children. So when we are researching children or accessing children, taking information from children, we are objectifying children. So in that case, how we look at children is that we don't seem to be sensitive to their vulnerability, their suffering. I'll give you 2 examples. One is you are facing a child soldier in war as a senior soldier. Are you supposed to shoot that child soldier? Suppose that child soldier is armed with a very dangerous weapon. The ERIC guideline says you are not supposed to first shoot or harm. You are supposed to exercise discretion and see the child in that person, even if that person might be in the garb of a soldier. When I read this, it is such a refined concept that even at the expense of risking your life, you ought not to compromise on your ethics as far as that vulnerable being is concerned. Why this discretion in case of a child? The child is not able to make sense of a just war or unjust war. A child has become a soldier not by choice. Narratives show, whether in the case of Yugoslavia or in the case of Rwanda, or in other cases where child soldiers were hired mercenaries, they were forced to carry arms by threatening that their brother will be killed, the parents will be killed, or they kill those brother or parent in front of their eyes and put them under such mental stress that they lose their connectivity to the world, they are vulnerable, not only as child, but as somebody who is not able to make sense of the reality. So such children are brainwashed and then they are released as child terrorists. Secondly, when that child is a girl child, the complexity becomes worse. That child is used as a sex slave, as somebody who has to cook the meal and entertain, sometimes dance to entertain the other soldiers. So we have read these reports in case of Lubanga trial, in case of other International Criminal Court trial. So I'm sure that in the national context of offenses against children and children as offenders, Justice Dalvi may bring out some of these points, and Justice Pansalkar ma'am may bring out some of these points. So for me, child is at the highest level of vulnerability by yet to be formed kind, being yet to be formed kind of mind, and secondly, physical frailty. Thirdly, the way in which the world is cruel to use such innocence to its dark agenda. So we see this in case of online portrayal of children, in case of families, and in case of crisis. Let me give you the idea of family. There has been a very interesting exclusive journal brought out by Springer on vulnerability. Now, this journal's one article I read, which talks about in the family context, how children are bearing the burden in terms of household chores, and they also are those who are not fairly treated. So fair treatment, child-centric treatment within the family itself is an area which law hasn't touched much. Law has touched it in the conflict context, but in the general context, policies and laws cannot enter into the sacrosanct space of the family. And the learned panelists will bail me out if I say that family has become the most dangerous space as far as children are concerned. So with COVID, such vulnerability became more pronounced. So I'm sure that Justice Shalini, who has taken her PhD in child rights, will definitely highlight some of this, and Advocate Anil also will be highlighting. Another example I would like to say is post-war situation, and in Indian context, when child soldiers are used in Naxalism and other cases, when you are looking at rehabilitation, how these children are disposing themselves, the kind of confusion, the kind of lack of trust, and the way in which they do not come out with these opinions, etc. So there have been guidelines which are saying that when you're talking to such a child, you ought to have a child psychologist with you, a psychiatric social worker with you, and only then as a researcher or as a lawyer you can talk. We lawyers are not, we are not right in assuming that because we are defending their case, we can deal with the child straight away. This sensitivity is something that in juvenile courts as well, some of the judges share with me that if you could provide us such support, it will be very good. So I requested some of these points to be brought to our discussion. Now, who is a child? It's very easy to say that somebody who is not of age is a child. But in India, we have different situations. We have had the independent thought judgment where a 14-year-old girl belonging to a particular faith system can be married as long as she has attained puberty. We have not touched this part. So this is one issue where marriage could be legalizing child rape, and marriage could be legalizing, and law could be a silent spectator, mute spectator in legalizing child rape, marital rape, and also in depriving the human rights of that child who is getting married. Now, what are those human rights? In the family, in the garb of the family, often these human rights are violated, and those child rights convention has clearly laid out education, empowerment, entertainment. If you go by that equation, most of the children in India, we have more than 54% of marriages happening before the age of 18 because of many reasons. Again, vulnerability is a reason why parents feel child is safer in the in-laws house than in their house, especially in poor households. So this is something to be questioned, whether our law has touched it, what else we can do. So the social dimension becomes very, very important there. Another issue that I would like to touch upon and leave in the context of vulnerability is when the very definition of child is something that needs to be questioned, is where we had a case of a mentally unwell child who became pregnant in a home, and then in an institution, and then she wanted to keep the baby. Then her decision or her expression of interest to keep the baby was challenged, and this was challenged in a normal court of law, and finally Delhi High Court had to intervene and say that she should be dealt in the juvenile court, and her issue should be handled sensitively, and she is physically 34-year-old, but she's a child. So the very idea of child, not just as physical age, but also as mental age, came into the fore by this 2019 judgment. So there have been working of the courts which have resulted in our country to look at children and vulnerability in a very broader way, but that sensitivity is at a certain level. It could be more. So that is what I expect out of this outreach program with the knowledge partner, to reach a wide range of stakeholders who are present here. I can see about 180 participants here. There must be thousands on the Facebook and later on the YouTube. I hope that children as the most vulnerable segment of our society, and the care for their vulnerability being taken into consideration as the utmost investment in future, because this is the reality that we invest in our children, we invest in our future, and invest in our nation. I must say that children's vulnerability needs all of us to soul search as parents, as teachers, and as members of the society. I must tell you also that when it comes to children's vulnerability, there is this story, I mean, research gathered from Uganda, when children were being interviewed about the nutritional research, like what they eat in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening. So the researchers were clubbing these children, putting these children together in a room, and they were administering a questionnaire. And then one child told that she doesn't eat her night meal because her father beats the mother after getting drunk. So a research which was created for nutritional research brings from the child another fact, that is domestic violence, and how it impacted the health of that child. Now, as a researcher, the ethics says that you are supposed to report the fact, but you're not supposed to overdo, you're not supposed to sidestep. So even in the family context, looking at children as beings with dignity, with autonomy, and balancing it with their well-being, and the way in which children sometimes make sacrifices when they know about the problems of the family. We know stories of child sex workers in our field work who became sex workers because they somehow wanted to support the family. So they went and asked for a job, and where they went and asked for a job, they were exploited into this. So children's innocence and their desire to support the family needs to be validated, and it has to be educated and managed. Otherwise, they become the target and they become vulnerable. So why should we know about such vulnerability? Before we judge a child as a criminal, for example, in the Nirbhaya debate, ordinary people on the street said that that juvenile was the worst bestial behavior accused, so he should be hanged. Why did you spare him? But I remember the television debate where Gopala Subramaniam came on and said that who has created him? Where has he come from? It is this society. So taking responsibility for the vulnerable, understanding the dimensions of the vulnerable will, I am sure, humanize the landscape of law and humanize lubricate the wheels of justice and humanize everyone's approach. And in that process, we unlearn and we relearn our own understanding of law and justice. So with that, I hand over the forum to begin with reflections on POCSO and social approach to Justice Roshan Dalvi. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, friends. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've got only 15 minutes to spare. I'll take you straight to my presentation. If you can just give me a minute. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. Can you allow me to please share my presentation?
I will do that, ma'am. Just a minute.
If you can, please. Yes, correct. Mhm. I should have told them.
Is it able, ma'am? Just check it out.
Okay, I'll just check it. Share. No, no, no. You have disabled. If it can be done, otherwise I'll just go on.
Not right.
Okay? Share.
Share. Screen. 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 Go left. Here. Here.
Okay, friends. See, these are the various offenses against children. I don't want to recite them myself for lack of time, but we know basically that all of these make children vulnerable. These are the specific offenses under POCSO. And the vulnerable children fall under one of these for specified specific treatment. The legal provisions must be first understood. We start with the Constitution of India, the IPC, the ITPA, Bonded Labor, DV Act, Child Labor Act, and more importantly, POCSO and Juvenile Justice Act. These are the ones which are required. Now, what we really must understand is the impact of the abuse on the child to make the child vulnerable. What really happens to that child when the child is brought into the justice system? Because just as Professor Gurpur said, that a child soldier or even the child accused of Nirbhaya was the make of the society. This is the child who has had all this impact of the abuse that was meted out upon him. It destroyed her psychology, devastated her life, it gave her a bitter shock. There was disgust, disbelief, suspicion, helplessness, frustration, anxiety, loss of security, feeling of guilt also in a society like ours, especially, fear of disclosure, and confusion of our justice system. So what we must understand is that there is always re-victimization or what we call secondary victimization. The child has to go to the police and give a statement. Now the child has to give a 164 statement before the magistrate. The child is taken for medical examination and gives a statement to the doctor. And ultimately the child comes for the court trial. When there'll be so many NGOs, if they are working for the child, etc., who have made the child repeat the trauma all the time. So the basic thing that is required for vulnerable children is this syndrome which happens. One is the child versus the adult syndrome. Now we understand that our criminal justice system is with the adult at its centerpiece. So there must be a child-friendly atmosphere which must be created for every child who comes to court. And then there is a victim versus accused syndrome, where again the victim is at the center stage. So the accused is at the center stage. And therefore we must have victim representation, victim support, and victim participation. Now this representation, support, and participation is exactly given in the POCSO for the first time. And that is the beginning of victimology in our criminal justice system. So how do we distinguish between accused and victim? As soon as the accused is arrested and brought or is brought before the magistrate and is committed to police custody, the accused after arrest has to be interrogated. So he is taken to the police. But the victim has not to be interrogated. The victim is rescued if the victim is trafficked, or if the victim just comes to court, then she has to be interviewed. And if she is a child, she must go before the Child Welfare Committee and not before the police. Therefore, the requirements of our criminal justice system are twofold, essentially: infrastructure and sensitivity. Interpretation, of course, is another thing, because we've got so many judgments and we are guided by the presidential law. So we have interpretation of those judgments. But in our infrastructure, we require these four things. Victim support centers. So as soon as a complaint is filed, there must be a support system for the victim. That is first now given under the POCSO, otherwise our victim is bad. But when we have this Mahila desk or the Shishu desk in the police, it is the first of the support systems, and it must work in partnership with certain NGOs who are. Then the victim examination suites would be required. At present, we have under 160 the statements which have to be recorded by the magistrates. When the victim has to be examined, it must be in a separate suite. Video recording of statements is another important infrastructure which we still don't have, because at that time, when the girl gives her statement, when a child gives her statement before the magistrate, there is an added trauma. So video recording would make it less traumatizing. And video recording of evidence is also required. At present, it is done. But if we don't have that infrastructure, then we can create it in our court, in our chamber, which is what I did, and I'll be telling to you presently about that. That requires sensitivity. And in the sensitivity aspect, we have court climate and courtroom conduct, which we will quickly go through so that I can tell you how best such kind of cases can be decided or tried. We have special courts, that is the POCSO courts. We have special officers, those are the lady prosecutors. Then we can have priority in disposal, which the judge gives a fixed date and a fixed time. Victim support and representation, the legal representation. The victim is made to speak to the judge. And the victim comes then not in contact with other court officials, but directly in contact with the court, not in contact with the accused also. Now, when the victim comes to court, the courtroom conduct is very important, and that is what Justice Gurpreet has said, is child-friendly. So we have evidence in chambers. Now, what happens is, that is exactly evidence in camera. If you see the dictionary meaning or the meaning of the law dictionary, it is evidence which is focused like in a camera, so that it is in a chamber. Now, I had this kind of trials with me, and I thought it was exceedingly useful that I called the child to my chamber first. I just only gave her my hand and said, "Beta, tujhe last time mere samne sab kuch bol dena hai, okay?" And she was saying, "Yes, auntie, okay." Then I called the lawyers, that is the prosecutor and the defense counsel, who flanked the girl right in front of me on the same table. Her mother's evidence was recorded, so she was kept on my left side, just opposite the child, and my steno was on my right side. The police was not in the room. My police and my peon were at the door because they would be required at some time. And after this was set, the accused was put right behind the child. Now, after the accused was only the wall, and the accused could hear and see the trial. So the accused gets all the rights that are the accused is entitled to get as human rights in court. And the child doesn't know that the accused is there. So I said the identification will come last. We began the evidence. The child gave me the entire story. And after that, when I asked her, "Who is it?" she tells me that, "Madam, that uncle is not here." So I said, "No, beta, you have to look. Chalo, idhar udhar dekho." And then she looks and she points to the accused. In the meantime, she got so frightened that I thought that she will not identify the accused. And because of her demeanor, which I saw, which I had to record as a trial judge, I decided that her face was his identification. But she turned back to me and she told me, "Madam, yehi uncle hai wo." So I thought that this evidence which I recorded in the chamber was exceedingly effective, meant for the purpose and for taking care of her vulnerability. I had a specific place for all, as you can see in the slide. Then, of course, there is victim confidentiality, which we always mention. We don't give the name of the victim. We should now give the name of the accused and make it the name and shame game. But when we record our evidence, we record it through court, give her rest times, give her breaks. This is the way it is done. And when it is done this way, a vulnerable child is given the support that she requires. Now, one of our very fine judges, today she is a High Court judge, when she was a POCSO judge, she said that she had very little infrastructure in her court. And what she did was she put the accused between two cupboards in her court so that the child cannot see the accused. But the only thing which was lacking was the child knew that there is someone there on the side of the cupboard. And she was deposing in the open court, which was in chambers, by telling everyone else who is not concerned with the case to get out. But what we must do is not only, of course, get anybody else in, but we should get all of them inside only who are required, so that the officers, etc., the accused, are not seen by the child. And that evidence in chambers becomes extremely effective. Now, when we are going to do this in the court, that is for the cases that come up in the court. But for cases that don't come up yet in the court, we have to do the work on the social scenario. So we must understand these two tests. Lesser numbers, greater attention. See, at home, in school, in countries, in courts, everywhere, where there are more numbers, the attention reduces. So when there are too many children in the family, every child becomes vulnerable to this onslaught of men. So we must understand when a child comes, from what background the child has come and how that child has become vulnerable. What was his home like? Is he from a slum where the children play on the roads? Is he from a large house where there are no parents for the child at all? The child is left with the servants and drivers. What is it? And that is how we understand this phenomenon. Then there is this test of 3 R's: recognize, resist, and report. So that first we have to recognize that this problem exists everywhere in the society. We must inform children, and there must be awareness creation for the children to resist good touch or bad touch or whatever that is. And if the child fails, the crime would have to be reported so that we bring the accused to justice. Now, for this, we require a synergy of the partners. That is into 2 parts, I would say, in the social scenario. The parents, teachers, friends, and NGOs form one part. You students and you as colleges can take up this responsibility with the NGOs. That they are the community service providers. So we give awareness creation training in schools, colleges, etc. These are the victim needs. If suppose we cannot protect the child enough and there has been an offense which is committed, then there is an attitudinal change required by medical officers, police officers, legal officers, judicial officers, and the criminal justice agencies, the NGOs, etc., who work. And they must work together as a team for synergy. It is then that we will have children of this type that must be everywhere in this world. Because, as we say, children are little people who need big rights. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Now the next speaker is Anil Malhotra, Advocate Anil Malhotra, who is going to speak on child support and custody COVID challenges. I think his response will be very pertinent because there was a question from the audience. Suppose the couple are separated and they have to share the child custody. How do they go about doing it? Probably, Advocate Anil, you must be answering this question in the course of your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, I would like to thank my young friends, Vikas and Subir, who have taken Punjab and Haryana on the globe. Not only India, by this webinars, both of them have led the country by webinars. They are young lawyers who have brought together a host of intelligentsia community among judges, among academicians, among professionals, and we have all had the fruitful benefit of exchange of personalities from all over the country. I'm extremely indebted to Professor Shashikala Gurpur for having had me on this panel and enlightening speakers and both friends, young friends, on issues pertaining to children. Friends, I will talk of an area which law does not look at. Professor Shashikala has very candidly identified vulnerability, pain, suffering, child sensitivity. Justice Dalvi has focused very well on a plethora of child offences in a very pictographical way and have encapsulated the propositions in the arena of laws applicable to them. But friends, I'm reminded of what Lord Alfred Tennyson said in Memoriam. So runs my dream, but what am I? An infant crying in the night, an infant crying for the light, and with no language but a cry. Friends, child custody, particularly interparental, is a concept which is not identified in law. We have to fall back on an archaic 1890 legislation, which is, let us say, 130 years old. And sadly and unhappily, when one parent takes away the custody of another child, of his own child, the other parent has to resort, or that parent has to participate in proceedings for guardianship, for custody. Despite the Law Commission making severe recommendations for recasting this law, concepts of joint parenting, concept of shared custody, which has evolved from very good judgments given by Professor Justice Dalvi and other judges of the Bombay High Court, they have still yet to see the light of the day. We have signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have signed the United Nations Convention on Adoptions, but we have not signed the Convention on Child Abduction. I was a part of the Hague Committee, which gave a report. We have suggested that this wrong should be identified as a wrong. It should not be called abduction. It should remain in the civil domain. The Parliament will look at it, obviously, whenever it gets time, and we will perhaps have a law. So, friends, with this background and what Justice Dalvi ended, I would think that William Wordsworth was not wrong when in 1802, in his poem, My Heart Leaps Up, he said, child is the father of man. He's right. And for me, as a practitioner in this realm for 36 years, anyone who makes anything to help a child is a hero for me. But friends, where are we today? What is the situation? The ideal situation is reunification of a family, amicable settlement of disputes, joint and shared parenting, and resolution of differences. But is that possible? In our country, except for major metropolitan cities, we do not even have family courts. I am sorry to say that Chandigarh does not have a family court. There is one existing, but it is not notified. So the matters still go to the district judge and guardianship matters still go to the civil judge senior division. Now, in these times, for child custody and child support, to have virtual hearings when physical presence is not possible, and for matters to be actually heard is going to be the biggest challenge. Wherever family courts exist, the biggest flexibility is the Family Courts Act. For most of you who are not familiar with the Act, Section 10 of the Family Court Act gives complete liberty to a family court to devise its own procedure for settlement, to ascertain the truth of facts, and Section 14 permits the court to receive as evidence any report, statement, document, or information which in its opinion is necessary to effectively deal with the dispute, even if it is not admissible under the Indian Evidence Act. Now, Section 5 and 6 of the Family Court Act permits the judge to associate social welfare agencies, counselors, etc., for the purposes of assisting. The best role model one can find, at least in the north, is in Delhi, where all the 5 jurisdictions where courts exist, there is a separate building for a family court. There is a principal family court judge. He's assisted by a team of mediators, counselors, and an additional judge, etc. I believe Bombay, the family court in Bandra is equally well equipped and functions equally well. I happen to have the privilege of interacting with family court judges when I do sessions at Bhopal. So it is a jurisprudence we have yet to build. We do not have a specialist family court bar. We do not yet have specialist family court judges except in certain metropolitan areas. And of course, we are still far away in developing a child rights jurisprudence. Now, what I see is, and what I perceive is, that we need to evolve a child-centered jurisprudence if we have to resolve the matters on child custody and child support in COVID times. Adults are just outdated children. Children are the hands by which we take hold of and go to heaven. Children make your life important. Children see magic because they look at it. Children should not be used as trophies. Children should not be used as pawns in battle games for custody and settlement of scores between parents. This shift of jurisprudence is very necessary in our country when child rights disputes are on the rise. And as Shashikala ma'am very rightly put it, children in the homes are the biggest victims, be it domestic violence, be it closeness. So that is why there should be space even in togetherness. But where is the space? There isn't. We have extended family support in normal times, which will be missing. We will not have access to courts because of reasons of COVID. We will not be able to have evidence recorded. We will not be able to have any method of devising adjudication of disputes. The Justice Hema Kohli, as we had discussed in our previous session with the Bar Council, has come up with a very good action plan for the family courts in Delhi. I wish other family courts take it up. We have to build up a mechanism of mediation, settlement, arbitration, or negotiation. Conventional settlement of child custody disputes and support systems is going to be very difficult. I remember a matter in the Delhi High Court where the father had custody of 3 daughters, and the mother, upon approaching the court, was permitted to have access to all the 3 girls through a television with internet connected to it, or a computer, with the door closed but not bolted. And in return, the mother got access every day. So methods like this will have to be devised. They do not exist on any statute book. Now, where is the law? Where is the process of statute? Now, visitation, contact, shared parenting, joint custody, taking decisions are concepts which are coined by courts. I have seen a judgment by Justice Abdullah Bhatkar, which is very well worded, and where she talks of a child parenting plan. She talks of shared parenting. I wish more courts would take that kind of a thing up. But friends, Section 26 of the Hindu Marriage Act gives us the right to take interim orders in matrimonial proceedings. As I told you, you can file an independent petition under the Guardian and Wards Act, and you will have your access to rights there too. But another looming factor which emerges very largely today is if parents use children for their own purposes in settling matrimonial disputes, we have what is now being recognized as parental alienation syndrome. It's a very serious dispute. Vivek Singh versus Rumani Singh, Justice Sikri has dwelt on it very well, and it is being noticed. And there are courts now saying we will not be able to decide the custody matter till the child gets an equal share of the other parent, because the child is very badly polarized. So this is another issue which is going to be increasing. Now, overseas custody cases, child contact, I have recently been, as my friend Vikas said, I have been recently appointed as a amicus in a matter where I was asked to assist the court to see what can be done about it. Now, in overseas matters where issues are arising out of child custody are concerned, our courts are reluctant to send back spouses who have removed children for the fear that they will be prosecuted, they will be without support. So I was able to successfully argue a matter in Delhi High Court where I was able to I was able to successfully prevail upon the court that I will abide by all the conditions which the court puts me. Now, once I had done that, the court wanted me to go and get the order mirrored, which meant that the Delhi High Court wanted me to get the conditions imposed by the Delhi High Court made a part of the US court order. The US judge agreed to it, and all those conditions were incorporated. The matter did go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court followed it. So, if we are not going to sign the Hague Convention, then I see the mirror order jurisprudence as the best method possible for ensuring child support and for custody being retained and shared by both parents, and the children being returned to the country of their habitual residence for resolution of their disputes. Justice Lukur in Suryavadanan had coined the concept, three issues: the theory of first contact, the principle of the jurisdiction of closest contact taking first, the theory of first strike, and comity of courts. In a subsequent judgment, in Justice Khanwelkar, in two judgments, reduced the scope and said only the principle of the jurisdiction of closest contact will have applicability. Comity of courts and theory of first strike will not apply. So this principle of the jurisdiction of the closest contact and the mirror order jurisprudence working, a successful return of children pattern can start. But friends, interparental child removal is not a wrong or an offense. Justice Dalvi had a big chart of all kinds of offenses vis-a-vis children. Interparental child removal was not there. It is not there because it's not a wrong, it's not an offense. Because under Section 6 of the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, the father and after him the mother shall be the natural guardian of the child, and the custody of the child less than 6 years of age shall be with the mother. Though preferential rights of parents has been done away by Justice Khanwelkar in the latest judgment of Lahari Sakhamuri, but the fact remains that interparental child removal needs to come in a statutory compass. Unless and until we put it as a wrong, like say confine it as a civil wrong or confine it as a violation of the rights of another parent, there will be no statutory remedy. If there will be no statutory remedy, there will be no procedure, there will be no remedy available. There will be no remedy available to go to a court. So in the light of the current situation, for the legislature or for a judgment to lay down by some practice directions, the defining of child removal by a parent as a wrong, offensive to the rights of the other parent is extremely important. The next issue which I wish to emphasize is on child support is becoming an extremely difficult and unenforceable remedy. Particularly when the parent is overseas, implementing that order is extremely difficult. If it is within the jurisdiction, restraints can be put on visitation, attachment can be ordered, and compulsory deductions can be made. But again, we need to devise through adjudication, and we need to work out through actual physical implementation, out-of-box thinking, some methods like the shared parenting or joint parenting methods by which we can break through this glass ceiling and come to a situation that children are more important in your life. And we should worry about what a child will become tomorrow. Yet we forget that he is someone today. What are we doing for him today? How are we helping him? This is what a judge, this is what a practitioner needs to understand. So friends, with these brief thoughts and not dwelling much into any more detail, so this is a topic which can go on endlessly, I will just hand over back to somebody who's much more mature, experienced and wise than me and has more experience, double my age, Professor Tambolkar.
So, Anil, you have highlighted, you have shown your rich experience, your authorship, and depth of knowledge on all facets of child custody and in this case, its relevance. There have been audience, large number coming from Orissa as well, who have been asking about the trauma that the parent who doesn't have the custody feels. And there is a very good research on CSG, I can't identify the person, who has given the research about how on an average 2 to 4 hours of access in a month is given by courts from Kanyakumari to Kashmir or Bengal to Maharashtra. So judges are insensitive, that is the accusation. Aren't they having children themselves is the accusation. We also have the issue of parental alienation syndrome. And in Mumbai, a wonderful innovation called parenting plan has been brought out in judgments. Mumbai High Court has issued guidelines to
Yes.
other judges at different levels.
Justice Mridula judgment is very good.
Yeah. So whether the family court should function like courts or rather as protectors of children is an issue to be debated. So I hand over the podium to Dr. Shalini Phansalkar Joshi, former judge of Bombay High Court, to take over.
Thank you, ma'am, and good evening to everyone. It's really a pleasure to share this dais with all the experts in the field, virtually, of course. We all agree, and it is undisputed that children are the most vulnerable section of our society, and that's why we are considering them in this vulnerable series. Out of these children, the children who are in orphanages are most vulnerable because they are defenseless, voiceless, powerless, and as they are at the higher risk of being subjected to abuse. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child 1989 therefore acknowledges that the family is the best and natural environment for the well-being and development of the child. Children belongs to family. Nothing can substitute the home or the parental care. However, the reality is that millions of our children are living in institutions or the orphanages. One estimate puts the total up to 8 million. Whereas in India, it is said that more than 261,000 children are in institutions or orphanages or whatever name we call as alternate care centers, etc. This institutionalization has lot of adverse effect, and this adverse rearing is clear in the children who are brought up here, brought up in these orphanages. As per the Lancet study, the consequences of children being brought up in such institution or orphanages are very, very severe one because of depersonalization, lack of personal possessions, care relationship or symbols of individual enforcement. As I said, these children lack family support, their exclusion from the community, the isolation, and total dependence on the staff managing in the institution further adds to their vulnerability, coupled with the fact that they are subjected to or susceptible to abuse at the hands of very persons in whose protection they are kept. Therefore, these children are the most vulnerable sections of the society. We all know that of all the forms of abuse or exploitation, sexual abuse is worst. It is a profoundly disturbing phenomenon and most traumatic experience. It prevails in all sections of society, and therefore naturally orphanages cannot be an exception for the same. The 2007 study conducted by the Ministry of Child and Women Development Department shows that children at work, children in institution care, and children on the street are reported to be the highest incident of sexual abuse and assault. Even the recent study of 2018 revealed that there are out of 9,589 childcare institutions across the country, 1,575 children were victims of sexual abuse and 189 children were victims of pornography. It is really shocking to know what Mr. Subhash Chakma, the director of Asian Center for Human Rights, has said, and here I quote, "It will not be understatement to state that juvenile justice homes, orphanages have become India's hell holes where inmates are subjected to sexual assault and exploitation, torture and ill treatment, apart from being forced to live in inhuman conditions. The girl remains the most vulnerable. In most cases, sexual assault in these homes continues for a long period as the victims are not able to protest and they suffer silently in the absence of any inspection by the authorities of these homes. Abuse of the children in institutions or orphanages occur mainly at the hands of the caretakers. With that, secondly, with their involvement at the hands of the outsiders, either children are taken out of the homes or outsiders are brought in the home. And lastly, where the older children abuse the younger children, because these children are kept together maybe on the basis of gender or age or some factors. And here, the abuse takes place amongst children themselves. In institutional settings, the trajectories of children's lives are derailed. There there are developmental deviations. This often manifests itself in the older child experiencing sexual play with the younger child, or an adolescent girl hungry for parental figure develops strong feelings towards a male authoritative figure. Such transgressions are dealt in the orphanages or outside in the courts with penalty or punishment, but underlying feelings and potential for engaging in such compromising behaviors is never addressed. As we all know, these orphanages or institutions, whether run by the government or privately, are very often poorly equipped, lack basic infrastructure, are badly managed, and as the evidence suggests, are proved to be the places of abuse and exploitation for all sorts. For children living in these institutions, their innocence becomes their burden. They remain at the mercy of staff there. Now, when we think of prosecution of child abuse as regards the children, such abuse must come to light, then only it can be prosecuted. And for such abuse to come to light, children must speak up. But then children themselves are unable to disclose about it as they are at the mercy of their abusers. They have no one to complain. They cannot go out of orphanage to complain. There is no support system at all. And even if someone comes to visit the orphanage in presence of the abuser, they cannot dare to say anything, far remain complaint. Moreover, even if they gather courage or get an opportunity to complain, they are unable to do so. As regards sexual abuse, they are totally confused. They experience the feeling of shame at times, hold themselves responsible, and therefore that guilt feeling is also there. In the absence of exposure to outside world, they may take it as a part of growing process also, not sure whether it is happening with them only or with others also. Moreover, we all know that sex is such a taboo subject in our society that children lack even the vocabulary to explain what abuser has done with them. Entire subject of child sexual abuse is shrouded in secrecy and denial. Therefore, for these children, it is not at all easy to speak about sexual abuse. How to broach the subject with them is a painful experience. Disclosure of such abuse is not a one-time event, but it is a process. You have to wait patiently, build up a rapport and trust with them. We have also to consider the plight of those children who are intellectually maybe deficient or those who are physically disabled, like deaf and dumb. And we have in Mumbai High Court or in Mumbai, Maharashtra, we are having several such cases where these mentally challenged children or intellectually deficient and physically disabled children were subjected to sexual assault and all sort of exploitation and abuse in the homes or orphanages run by this privately government aided privately run institutions. One of the glaring cases was highlighted by Mumbai Mirror in the year 2010, and thereafter the Mumbai Court has taken suo motu cognizance. Several directions were issued, the expert committee was appointed, and then the children were our children get ultimately got the justice. I had occasion to conduct one of such case of children, these children who were kept in Shahapur at Kavadas Institute in Shahapur in Thane district, and the trauma which they had undergone while reciting everything in the court or in the entire investigation and trial process. I mean, that is something which we can't imagine also. And that is something which I feel that the trial of these cases is really a traumatic experience for everyone. We have the POSCO Act, we have the procedure of mandatory reporting, but then mandatory reporting has not preceded with our equipping our criminal justice system. Our criminal justice system is too harsh for a child victim because we don't have the facilities like victim examination suites or everything. It may be true that the POSCO Act has made several provisions. I mean, it is the most comprehensive law, it's substantive law, it has provided for the aggravated form of sexual assault so far as children in these orphanages or alternate care institutions are concerned, highest punishment. They have also provided for establishment of special court, but the fact remains that we lack the basic infrastructure, we lack the requisite sensitivity at times, and therefore on all the stakeholders or duty holders. And then there is a gap between the law on the paper and the law in the implementation, which ultimately add to the trauma of these witnesses when they prosecute the abuse to which they are subjected. Surprisingly, the immediate laws that address protection of children are so far as children within the orphanages are the JJ Act and the rules. JJ, Juvenile Justice Act, talks of protection and punishment, but not prevention of this abuse. While rules contain provisions to address living conditions in the institutions or orphanages, but there are no specific provisions to address abuse or crimes of such sort within institutions. As I said, the POSCO Act on paper, it is very innovative. It incorporates all the guidelines laid down by the Supreme Court in the various judgments of Sakshi versus Union of India, Gurmeet Singh versus State of Punjab, or Delhi Domestic Workers Association. But in practice, and it fails in implementation as majority of courts do not have sufficient infrastructure, audio video facilities, waiting room, panel of expert interpreters. Reading children of institutional abuse therefore needs not only the protection of law but its effective implementation in letter and spirit. Social laws are difficult to implement and it requires a long-term endeavor to do so. The joint efforts of all the agencies like National and State Commission for Protection of Children, they must be empowered to ensure accountability and also to take action rather than only make recommendations. What is important is that our orphanages and the institutions are not open for scrutiny from outside bodies. Why they should be closed like prisons? Children are not prisoners. Therefore, there is need for expert civil society members to regularly visit them, to talk with children, to submit the reports, and those reports should be acted upon. It requires, therefore, institutional, care, constant monitoring and review. For the first time, such mapping of alternate care homes in India took place after the order was passed by the Supreme Court in the year 2013. Now we have juvenile justice committees both at Supreme Court and High Court level, headed by senior judges. They are now entrusted with the duty of implementation of these laws and monitoring of these institutions. But most importantly, in my considered opinion, what is required is our criminal justice system must be humanized to shift the perspective of justice towards healing that meets child victims' needs, repairs the harm arising from abuse, and offer options that encourage and empower them to talk about abuse. Therapeutic jurisprudence in child abuse must be developed, and restorative justice models from other countries in this respect can be adopted. What is ultimately required is need to inculcate child rights based approach. With this, I conclude to keep it within the time limit, and I hand over and revert back to the just Dr. Shashikala Bulbul.
Wonderful, ma'am. Thank you. That is such a comprehensive view. At par with the other judge who gave us the view as well. So I'm very happy to place on record before I invite Professor Jambolkar to give a quick response. Two important participants here who have given some comment. The most important one is Child Rights Foundation from Mumbai, which has been one of the respondents here, and we are very honored to have them because first of all, they said that the parenting plan which I mentioned, they said that it was Justice Roshan Dalvi who implemented it. So congrats, ma'am, for setting a great trend, and I have been witnessing its impact in my research. Secondly, that it is the Child Rights Foundation which had assisted or rather influenced this kind of a development through the litigants, and that today the child rights, the parenting plan according to them has been implemented in Kerala, Punjab, Haryana, Karnataka, Himachal Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh. So some of the states are yet to toe the line, some of the high courts. So it's a great matter of honor. And now with that, I invite Professor Lakshmi to quickly respond for 5 to 6 minutes, please.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Gurpur. I'm a self-invitee. I'm sorry. I hope I did not butt in the already made program. So I actually had to find myself only one topic and prepare a briefest possible response. So that's exactly what I have done. The panel discussion was excellent. I really enjoyed it. And I prepared a very small note. I'll just read it out. It is, see, my interest here is domestic violence and the Hague Convention on Abduction. This is the title that I have chosen for my presentation. The Hague Convention on Abduction acknowledges certain exceptions. You know, the main point in the Hague Convention is forthwith return of the abducted child. That was the main objective of the convention by and large. And it has created certain exceptions to the otherwise mandatory return of the child. It is the grave risk defense. And this is one of the exceptions. Grave risk is a exception which you find in Article 13B of the convention that I'm referring to. Domestic violence is not yet seen as a grave risk to the child. It's unfortunate. It is really the silent spectator of the child who watches his mother being beaten up left, right, and center and unable to go to her rescue. And what will be the trauma that the child will be undergoing? This is what the main cause which resulted in the child parental abductions. Under no circumstance I would never call it as a wrong. It is the biological parent who removes the child, but to stop him from watching such gruesome scenes. There is a significant, the domestic violence is not yet seen as a grave risk to the child. There is significant social science evidence to suggest that violence against the mother will expose a child to the possibility of psychological or physical harm. Many domestic jurisdictions recognize such exposure consequences. But in the Hague Convention, cases there is general reluctance to it, to acknowledge this as an acceptable reason for not returning a child back. In domestic violence cases, battered mothers living abroad anywhere fled with their children. These women subsequently faced child abduction lawsuits brought by their batterer. As the convention focuses exclusively on children, it does not explicitly recognize domestic violence between children's parents as a reason to deny the children's return. Many families experience both domestic violence and child maltreatment. There are at least 3 reasons that I can come out with for this, to study the domestic violence in custody cases. The first is children are at the heart of the domestic violence cases. Scope and extent of the domestic violence affecting the family relationships. Then thirdly, increasing globalization has resulted in the transnational families, which further continued as transnational custody abduction disputes. A very important issue in this context: how do courts account for domestic violence role in custody and abduction cases? In one write-up, it was observed, I quote, "Judges are now almost universally under a statutory obligation to consider domestic violence as a factor when determining the best interest of children. Domestic and family violence presumes that it is in the child's best interest to reside with their non-violent parent. There is need for continued research on child abduction and its relationship to domestic violence. Such measure may contribute to a new convention or protocol for to secure worldwide ratification. Extensive, a higher number of ratifications is not a guarantee. It's every country has its own reasons for that. DV, domestic violence, frequently plays a role in parental abductions, as between child safety and the prompt return. Surely the needle will always indicate towards the former, that is the best interest of the child. Well, this is the very shortest possible intrusion that I can come out with as a last resort. I wish I get a bigger opportunity to come out with a different and long submission.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. It has been a very enriching infusion, I must say. We learned a lot, and your published article in Springer Journal is also very noteworthy, where you have more facts to present. And I'm sure that the organizers will look into future themes because you are an expert in international law and human rights. Now, there are 2 responses. One is Professor Sudipta from our team talks about how UNICEF has recently released Protecting the Most Vulnerable Children from the Impact of Coronavirus, an agenda for action, where they have said that this crisis has snowballed into child rights crisis, from right to health, nourishment, water, sanitation, hygiene, education, and the right to be protected from violence, exploitation, and abuse. I remember Justice Dalvi and Justice Pansalkar, when we were mentioning about it. So refugee and migrant children's further complex vulnerability is something that she is bringing into, and how children are the worst victims of both pandemic and war. Other questions, as they come, we can respond. I would request Anil to respond to one dimension. Maybe the other learned judges can also respond to that, connected to Professor Jambulkar's mention. Parental alienation syndrome. Could you talk about that? I mean, how does law respond to that when the alienation is induced because of the operation of the law? Although Professor Jambulkar says that domestic violence could be a good justifying ground for alienation as fleeing the risk to life, whether it has to be calibrated in multiple circumstances, especially having an access to a parent, whether in the prison or in the psychiatric ward, there should be some kind of access, some kind of protection of that relationship vis-a-vis the syndrome created by alienation. I was told by one of my activist friends that when the most abusive parent also comes, the child just goes and hugs that parent because child forgets the abuse that it has undergone in the hands of such a parent. So, what are your take?
First
My
of all, I
learned
would,
co-panelists. Anil, to begin with, yes, Anil, please.
yes, ma'am, first of all, I would like to answer Professor Lakshmi Jamborkar's concerns on domestic violence in the Hague Convention. Point number one, India has not signed and is not signing the Hague Convention on Child Abuse. Point number two, there is a 2-volume report of 13-member panel constituted by the Government of India of 6 judges, 6 government officers and myself, in which we have given a definition to interparental child removal, and we have added our own exception, and domestic violence is one exception vis-a-vis the return of the child. And just for the knowledge of everybody, even if we sign the Hague Convention, we will not sign on the dotted line. We will make an enabling law within our own country. We will create our own exceptions, and there only after we will put things into place. So we are yet far away. Point number 3, how do we take care of domestic violence when we are ordering the return of children? In the mirror order jurisprudence which I have put across and which is evolved, I was put 2 conditions. Number 1, I will not live with the mother and the children. I will live in a separate flat. I will not separate the mother from the children. I will not pursue domestic violence. I will provide $9,000 a month for all support services, education and maintenance till the lady finds a job or till she is rehabilitated. Next condition, I will ensure that the speedy resolution of the dispute takes place, and I will not pursue any criminal litigation. So we have to find ways and means of warding off domestic violence and using domestic violence as a ground by a concept of judicial innovation. Since we do not have a law and we are not blindly signing the Hague Convention, I would think taking a view that the Hague Convention is bad, it may be very bad, but we are not signing it, so that is not an issue. And now coming to Professor Shashikala's issue, how do we take care of parental alienation syndrome? I happened to argue a matter, and I was surprised to my utter sheer curiosity that the family court judge in Tisari, Delhi, raised the concept of parental alienation. She said the mother insisted that the judge should talk to the children. The judge said, I'm not going to talk to the children. The children have been with you for 1 year. The father has had no contact. So I'm not going to talk to the children. Justice Sikri in Vivek Singh and Nomani Singh said, we have interviewed the children in chambers. They are blindly wanting to go with the mother. They don't even want to see their father. But we are not deciding the dispute till the father is brought on the level playing ground and has got equal access and is equally aligned with the children. We will not be able to decide the custody dispute. So, ma'am, parental alienation is a serious psychological disorder. It has been recognized by the WHO as a psychiatric disease. We need counselors. We need experts. We need social workers. We need good counselors. We need good court associates. And all these reports, Perry Cassindra's judgment in the Supreme Court says, are now ought to be available to the council. That domain, that the reports or what the child counselors heard or said or what a mediator said is not going to be available to the council, is a thing of the past. We have to build families. We have to put together families. So parents must also be made to understand that if you alienate your child, you are bringing up a child in a broken home. I remember my first case of interparental child removal, which I did in 1986. We could not recover the child. The High Court gave me a roving writ and said, whenever you find the child, come back, case adjourned, sine die. That boy is married, lives in England. Mother brought him up. She recovered him in the US after 10 years of looking around. Even despite the mother having done all this, He now complains to the mother that you alienated me from my father. And he doesn't want to see her anymore. So these can be the serious consequences of long-term separation. The ideal situation today is for the courts to devise plans, as the Bombay High Court has been the pioneer. Justice Dalvi's judgment, Justice Bhatkar's judgment, these have to come forward. I have recently got a shared parenting order in the case of a police officer and a law lecturer, whereby Monday to Friday the child is with the mother, Saturday, Sunday the child is with the father. If you can't get along, share the child. The child loves the father, the child loves the mother. You may be a very bad husband or a very bad wife, but you are an excellent parent. So why should not the child have the father and the mother and the best of all worlds? And as I said, children are the hands by which we take hold of heaven. So why don't we create heaven on earth? That's what I have to say now.
Thank you. So I would request the learned
There's one
panel.
question for Mr. Anil. I would read that question for Mr. Anil. He can answer that.
Can you read?
Ma'am, I'm just seeing because there are so many chats.
No, in the meanwhile, let's have Justice Dalvi to respond to this issue,
Yes,
because she's the mother of that concept. So, ma'am, please. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Ma'am, I will have to unmute you. I will have to unmute you. Just hold on for a minute.
There was a time when lawyers were muted by judges.
But after retirement, then, yeah.
This is
Please,
what,
ma'am.
So this is Justice Vikas Chatrat now.
No, not at all. For us, judge is a judge. As they say, 24/7,
Always a judge.
So the ladyship speaks, please, ma'am.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now, you see, what happens is that we should be joined, even if we are divided in matrimony, we should be joined in parenting. That is the motto. That should be there. You know. Now, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for various reasons. It's not only that the non-custodial parent doesn't want the, or rather the custodial parent doesn't want the non-custodial parent to come, but quite often it is actuated by lawyers. This phenomenon gets accentuated. You know. Now, may I do one thing? May I give you a small presentation on this also? If you can put me on to that, please.
I will do that. Meanwhile, Mr. Anil, your question for you was by Manoj Gandhi. Advocate Anil, sir, on your comment to interparental abduction, you mean that after sharing joint custody, interparental abduction is legal just because the abductor has been a parent?
No, there is no legality in any abduction.
Just one moment.
You see what happens is this.
Mr. Gandhi, first of all, let us stop using the word abduction. The word abduction finds name in the convention, but in the definition, it is interparental child removal. So wrongful confinement of a child by one parent to deprive the other parent of custodial rights or any right to take a decision in the vis-a-vis the child is wrongful retention or removal of a child. Nobody abducts a child. I remember recently the Delhi High Court registered suo motu a case of kidnapping against a father who had removed a child to Dubai. The matter went to Supreme Court. I was asked to assist a very senior able counsel, and we told the court, the father is not a terrorist. The father is not a criminal. He has just removed his child. The matter can be resolved. The Supreme Court is looking into it, and Justice Khanwilkar took very effective steps in stopping everything, even the CBI going abroad and to bring the man back. So abduction is a wrong phraseology to use in the home, first of all. Secondly, if one parent removes the child from the custody of the other, the custodial rights of the other parent should be restored. And once they are restored, the wrongful effect goes away. So it is a question of bridging the gap. It is a question of building the bridge and bringing back status quo ante as it was. So in a sense, since there is no wrong, there is no offense. Let us understand parental child removal is not a wrong under any law in India. And as Professor Jabolkar said, under Section 6 of the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, the father and mother are natural guardians. So how can you accuse a parent of removing a child or abducting a child? So I would think that Mr. Gandhi's question is answered by the fact that since there is no offense, there is no restoration of any wrong, there is no remedy vis-a-vis the law is concerned. So unless and until we come up with shared parenting plans and joint custody as concepts by amending the Guardian and Wards Act and by amending the custody laws, we actually cannot look at all these philosophies, though we may still do by judicial innovation. I think Dalvi ma'am's presentation would be very apt at this point of time.
Before Dalvi ma'am, you just start the screen sharing. One person, the joint class, he has posted separately, privately to me. He says, anybody can answer. In today's world where divorce cases are increasing at an alarming rate, in case parents who live separately due to difference in opinion, how do you think shared parenting / joint child custody can be implemented, giving the best interest of the child uniformly across India?
I think the best way to handle this would be for access to virtual rights. So we will now have, I think we will have international family law in a virtual world. So access, see, if after winning till the Supreme Court, I can't go to the US or I can't go back anywhere, where is my access? Where is my custody? Where are my rights? I think they're only virtual rights. Till physical contact is not possible. The ways and means, as the Delhi High Court carved out, internet connectivity, access to a computer, talking on telephone, talking on Skype, and most important, taking the one parent who is in custody ought to take all important decisions with the child, schooling, hospitalization, medical care, upbringing, in consultation with the other parent. Involve the other parent. If necessary, use the medium of the court to get an order. And I would chip in to say to Dalvi ma'am, lawyers do have to play a role there. Lawyers have to put parties together, not make them fight. That is very important. So that answers the question.
Ma'am, you can, we have allowed you that screen sharing part. You can do that. Roshan ma'am, Dalvi ma'am.
Yes.
We have allowed that screen sharing part.
You see, we have to have meetings. We have to have some kind of mediation, negotiation. And between two parents, we have to chalk out a plan as to when, where, and how the child will be taken. I have done this in two of my matters. One was in Goa and one was in Bombay. And that was when both parents were kind of understanding. In one matter, there was only one lawyer. And I told that lawyer that you are now a lawyer for both the parties and I am here with you. And we worked out a whole settlement. So that
did you get him 2 fees?
Consent terms where we said about how the child would be taken, where he would be taken from school, etc. Now, the last judgment of February is of the Supreme Court in the case of Mahendra Thanai versus Nimita Thanai, where the Supreme Court has granted custody to one parent from Thursday to Sunday and another parent from Sunday to Thursday. So the children will be going from one place to another, and I suppose subject to the convenience of the child, it will be working out very well, because at each stage the child gets the mother as well as the father.
Ma'am, I said that we have allowed that screen sharing. You wanted to share something on the screen sharing. I'm talking to Justice Dalvi.
I do it on screen sharing if you allow me, please.
Ma'am, we have allowed that. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, I'll do that just now.
In fact, on the chat box, people are praising the system, the way you took things ahead.
Just one minute.
Meanwhile, Ms. Kakali Chatterjee is asking whether the separated
I've got
parents
this.
can go with this. Separated parents and the child custody.
Which
So
one, ma'am?
if you want me, tell me to start.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
We'll start now. We'll continue with it.
Okay. So the first structure is family, FAMILY. Father and mother, I love you. That is what happens with almost every child.
Yeah.
No matter how bad the father, as Justice Gurpur said, the child goes to hug the father. Now, what do these children need? They need love and praise. They need a tug of peace. They don't need a tug of war. That is the main thing to be understood. And between the parents, there should be teamwork. Together, each achieves more. That is, for that, the acronym is TEAM. And here, if you see, there are two, three things. One is that the child is united or is untied. What do the children want? The children will see you by what you live, not by what you say. This is what must be taught to parents. You must have workshops for parents that, when you have to live it, and a child always understands that. But the main thing is why there are these dysfunctional families. If you can see, there are various reasons why dysfunctional family continues. These are the ones that I have given you by Dr. Joshi, who is a psychiatrist, but there could be many more. Then there are certain attributes of a broken home, mainly anger, anxiety, confusion, depression, frustration, insecurity, child problems, and it also results in violence. Then these are the attributes of poor parenting, which must be understood. That there is some kind of abusive behavior, then there is appeasement of the child, humiliating behavior, neglect, or impartial work. Then there is the result. What are the results of poor parenting? It is this. And with this comes the custodial and non-custodial aspect. So I would say the greatest gift we can give our children are the roots of responsibility and the wings of independence. This is what Khalil Gibran had said. Because children don't need our presence, they need our presence. This is, of course, for the parents themselves, not for us really. But therefore, the parents have to be in the parents' memories tomorrow, you have to live in their lives today. I think this is very, very great. It's given by our Justice Hansaria in a judgment. I am the child, you hold in your hand my destiny. You determine whether I shall succeed or fail. Give me the things that make for happiness. Train me that I may be a blessing to the world. So that's how we have these faces of children. You see, it is this parenting and this anger anxiety syndrome that really sort of, has to be tackled. And it has to be tackled in each family at each stage. That's all at present I would say, because I'm not making a whole presentation on parenting.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. And let's just ask Justice Fansalkar also to respond at least for overall issues, because ma'am had her PhD in child rights, so I'm sure she has.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
About these family court matters and child custody. In my opinion, all these plans, joint parenting plan, etc., works provided the parents are mature sufficiently. I mean, they understand the significance of their presence in the lives of the children. They understand the significance of the other parent in the life of the children. And at times, the marital discord has changed their mental state to such an extent that it becomes really difficult a task to make them see the reason. That was sometimes the experience when we preside over the family court, and I had really that experience, that to make them see the reason is really a challenge. And for that, we have to take the assistance of multi-stakeholders like, psychologists, psychiatrists, the counselors. Everyone has to put in his effort. It is said in Africa that there is a proverb in Africa that to raise a child, entire village is required. So rearing of a child is not easy task or a simple thing to do, but everyone has to put in his efforts, understanding the significance of the child, as Advocate Malhotra has said, that with the child, holding the child's hand, we go to heaven, or it may be child is our future, or it may be, as Supreme Court has said several times, that it is the supreme national asset. And therefore, if we want to, we always talk of preserving the planet. But then if we don't have the better future, better progeny for the planet, what is the use of having the better planet? We talk of environment, but we never talk of preserving our future generation in the proper mental state of mind, physical state of mind. And this corona or the COVID pandemic has made us aware that life is so fragile that we have really to hold to whatever hand we get in touch with, and the child's hand. For the child, we have to create that nest of security, safety, protection, love, care, affection, whether that child is in our home, outside home, or whether in orphanage or alternate care institution, whether the child is with single parent or with both the parents, but the child needs that family because child belongs to the family and child needs that love and care. And it becomes the duty of all of us to provide that love and affection to the child. This is the time because child is growing. I mean, child may not remain child for all the time to come. I mean, he's in the stage of growing. He will become an adult. So this is the time that we have to intervene. We have to provide that requisite support. And if not we, then who will? Because we are holding the law, we are holding the responsible positions. We are academicians, we are advocates, we are judges, we are law graduates, we are studying law, we are doing social work, we are members of civilized society. So it is for each and everyone to contribute to make the future of our children better secured, better prospect, and with equipping them, empowering them. It should be journey from really now whether their child is caught in marital discord or caught in orphanage or caught in prostitution or other areas. But it should be the journey from exploitation to empowerment of the child, to make the child empowered to take note that yes, he is being subjected to abuse or he has remedies to get rid of it. Then only we can achieve really the better work for our children. That's what we have all discussed, and we have all from our own aspect or perspective, we have suggested different ways, and that appears to be the really fruitful discussion. That's what I would say, Ms. Dr. Gurpur, your inputs were really, I mean, they guided the discussion, and from that angle, we know what to say, I mean, how to go about this panel discussion. So it was really an enriching experience. Thank you.
Over to Vikas now. Yes.
I just, since we had our Professor D.N. Johar, I thought that he's always well known. I thought that I should ask Sir to give his insight since he's a person of immense knowledge. Over to you, Professor D.N. Johar.
Thank you, Vikas, first of all, for your kind words which you used for me. As a matter of fact, I learned about this event only this morning from Anil. And I promised him that I'll be joining for two reasons. Anil, I know what he is and the kind of bright student I have. And Lakshmi Jambolkar is another one. She is a very learned colleague of mine. So I was interested in listening to them, but I am also blessed by the views of other people also. I'm so thankful to them for that purpose. Basically, I can only thank them. Actually, I don't want to comment because I have not done my homework, very honestly. But I think I'll just add one small footnote to it. And that is that the moment you talk about the parent and the child, one basic truth, and particularly in the Indian context, which has to be kept in view, is that the child after birth opens his eyes with his mother, with his father, or wherever they are living in that small house. Whatever the learning he gets, how to speak, how to sit, how to walk, how to wear clothes, how to comb your hairs, everything he's learning from his parents only. There's no other teacher available to him except the family members. And please remember, his learning starts very early. And whatever he learns from the family, that lives with him. A father who himself is dishonest, telling his 10-year-old son to be honest, at that age he may not be able to revolt. But please remember, in his heart of heart, the child knows that what nonsense are you telling me? At the moment he's grown up that much, then he tells him in his face. What Anil was arguing, I think I endorse that view. The fellow who is in England and is married is telling his mother that you are absolutely not only unfair but cruel to me, that you deprived me of my father. I think that's all what my comment is. Thank you so much. So nice of you. It was a wonderful and learning experience for me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With the leave of Professor Shashikala Gurpur, I think the questions have been taken up and we have all had discussions on a different spectrum, everybody giving the insights, which had its own perspective in its own way. But I'm quite sure that after this session, that once we heard 5 panelists speaking on different topics, but one thing before we wrap up, one thing I can say that Shashikala Gurpur ma'am has a knack to tap the right persons, and that the common point between all the 5 panelists were directly or indirectly they were connected with Symbiosis Law School, and that we have been talking whenever we had the webinars. That is one of the reasons that Symbiosis Law School has created its niche. The session has been so enriching. At least I can speak for myself, and the panel, on the chat box also speaks volume, and more so about Justice Roshan Dalvi and Justice Joshi. That people are writing the fact that how they had put things forward while they were judges, and again the volume of the manner in which Professor Lakshmi, Mr. Anil Malhotra, Professor Shashikala Gurpur, Justice Roshan Dalvi, Justice Joshi have put the things in the right tone. And one thing after seeing Ma'am Roshan Dalvi and Shashikala putting things forward, it gives insights that knowledge has no barrier to the age. We have somehow, rightly or wrongly, the age of superannuation. But it shows that they have not retired. Their zeal to contribute towards the society is continuing. Professor Dean Johar is a testimony of that fact. It was a wonderful session. I will just ask our partners, Symbiosis being represented through Professor Shashikala Gurpur, so to also say a vote of thanks on our behalf. But before we end up, I will just like to say that tomorrow we have a webinar on rights to claim by Justice J.R. Mehta, a judge of the Delhi High Court. Do stay connected tomorrow at 5 p.m. Over to you, Professor Shashikala Gurpur. At least I can say that during all these 10 days, I have learned a lot, the way to move things forward, how to become more streamlined, a different way to connect people. At first instance, when you told that there are to be 4 panelists or 5 panelists, I'm slightly jittery how to think move forward. But under your aegis and guidance, Beyond Law CLC have been able to take things much forward. We are more confident that we can have panelists, and how to maintain the balance between the panelists is also an art to be learned from. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Vikas, and I thank my respectable fellow panelists. I thank the audience for a wonderful participation and wonderful questions. Some distinguished audience, including Professor D.N. Jauhar. My special thanks to Professor Lakshmi for great insights, experienced insights. And my fellow panelists have really given a new perspective, lot of food for research. I must acknowledge my esteemed colleagues, including Dr. Bindu, Dr. Shelke. I think one of our fellow directors is also here. There are people from across India, from right from Madhya Pradesh to Punjab to Delhi to Pune to Mumbai to South, Orissa, Mangalore. So thank you all for enriching this whole experience. And this is our last session with Beyond Law CLC for this academic year. Thank you, Vikas, for taking all that initiative, sometimes at the lightning speed, with so much of efficiency and also accommodating a lot of high standard demands. I mean, working with Symbiosis Law School, Pune is quite difficult for the insiders as well, because we have very high standards. That will speak for itself. Our fellow panelists who are here are all our esteemed, distinguished professors. So it speaks volumes that if students can relate to such eminent people, so the eminence is in our excellence is in our culture. As I wind up, I would also share with you, thanks to all such initiatives, organizations like you, audience like you, and the fellow panelists and the distinguished resource persons like you, today in the India Today ranking, we have again emerged as third best law school in the country, and in the schools of eminence as the topmost law school. This distinction is possible. You said that judges, even after retirement, they continue to be justice. I think rule of law, of which legal education is a part, and law serving the end of justice. All of us, once we are justice workers, as advocates, as students, as lawyers, as law researchers, law teachers, and judges, we are wedded to the calling of justice. Therefore, there is no end to perfecting the idea of justice and the deliverance of justice, especially for our progeny, for the next generation, and for the future of this planet, as Madam Pansalkar said. And as Justice Dalvi said, we can't love them enough. And justice is that precondition for such a love and peace. So, thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am. And tomorrow's topic is law relating to false claims by Justice J.R. Mehta. So please do join. And as ma'am said, that to maintain the standards of SLS is tough. Yes, I learned during these 10 days. But as they say that if you want to improve, keep a better person ahead of you so that you can try to catch up. And that's the way forward. I think that I was somehow, maybe not to the full extent, but the team was able to catch up with, to that extent, the standards which SLS tries to maintain.
You did. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. To all the participants who are on the Zoom platform and to all the participants who are watching us live on the Facebook, thank you, everyone. And also to the participants who will watch us subsequently when we will upload this video on the YouTube. Thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.